Hello and welcome everyone to our presentation on allyship. My name is Georgine Huang, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Fairygodboss. Fairygodboss is proud to partner with Henkel. For those of you who aren't familiar with us and logging in today, Fairygodboss is the largest career community for women. Millions of intersectional, diverse, and ambitious women come to Fairygodboss every year in search of advice, support, and information. We have a social mission to help women achieve their career goals through our unmatched free resources like anonymous job reviews for women by women, peer-to-peer networking, support and advice, and job listings of open roles and recruiting events that are sponsored by employer partners like Henkel, who are invested in diversity and inclusion.
Did I skip one? Okay. My name is Lasheen Williams, and I'm a lead brand strategist for Fairygodboss. I work with employers every day who are looking to attract, influence, and hire and retain diverse employees.
To set the stage for today's conversation about allyship, let's all think for a minute about two questions. What does allyship mean to you? And what's the biggest question that you have about allyship? Keep these two questions in mind throughout the day because we hope to cover this topic of allyship inside and out. Don't be shy, drop your questions and thoughts about what allyship means to you into the chat, and we will use your thoughts and questions to ensure that you're getting everything out of today's webinar and addressing them throughout our time together. Lasheen and I are both extremely passionate about allyship. When Fairygodboss was getting launched a few years ago, I couldn't have imagined how quickly the tide would have turned in favor of diversity and inclusion being a major corporate priority. In a few short years, Lasheen, do you mind going to the next slide? We've seen diversity topics making the headlines, often for not such good reasons. You can see here that the George Floyd murder was definitely very traumatic for the country, but also really galvanized corporate America. The pandemic caused many, many women to drop out of the labor force due to caretaking requirements and needs. And COVID caused a big backlash in terms of Asian hate incidents as this demographic were blamed for something as scientifically unsound as it was. And a couple months ago, we had Pride Month, and you could see that corporate America has really started to embrace the concept of allyship. That was one of the most common words I saw in relation to many companies' announcements about allyship.
Absolutely. So, all of this attention and focus on diversity and inclusion and this recognition that things have to change has made day-to-day work feel uncomfortable for some employees, even among those of us with the best of intentions. Some of the reasons we feel uncomfortable around DE&I topics are very understandable, though. People are scared of doing or saying the wrong thing. People are worried that they're going to be insensitive or accidentally offend someone, or even be accused of being performative and not substantive. People are worried that they just don't know enough to use their voices.
What we're going to talk about today is what we individually can do and what role we can play in allyship, regardless of what our title, seniority level is, or formal powers may be at our workplace and company. And regardless, quite frankly, of whether we identify individually as a member of any specific underrepresented minority group.
So, let's start with the poll. Let's get a little interactive. Which definition of an ally resonates with you? A, Allyship is the lifelong process in which people with privilege and power work to develop empathy towards another marginalized group's challenges or issues. B, allyship is an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with the marginalized group. C, allyship is efforts by groups of people to advance the interests of marginalized groups, both in society at large and within particular social contexts, such as universities or workplaces like this. And then D, allyship is a strategic mechanism used by individuals to become collaborators, accomplices, and co-conspirators who fight injustice and promote equity in the workplace through supportive personal relationships and public acts of sponsorship and advocacy.
Are you feeling confused yet? Seeing some answers in the poll. Well, if you are, you're in good company. After all of those definitions were from well-known sources published online, and they're clearly not identical.
While all of these definitions are slightly different, what we believe is that their most important aspect is their emphasis on action and taking action.
So what we're going to focus on next is which actions and what activities it does take to become an effective ally. But first, it all starts with paying attention. It's as simple as that, but allyship requires being actively aware and paying attention to things like implicit biases, social dynamics, your feelings, and your colleagues' emotions. The more that you notice about what's going on around you and within yourself, the more effective you will be at promoting positive behavior and intervening when you see an issue.
And now another level of awareness was mentioned by one of the definitions of allyship that we read. It involves educating oneself. Remember the lists of required reading about how to be an anti-racist that came out on all the newspapers, top books lists of the summer of 2020 after the George Floyd murder? Awareness doesn't have to just be situational, but can also involve reading and studying and watching documentaries. It can mean attending webinars, just like this one, going to events held by employee resource groups or advocacy groups.
Another thing beyond awareness that it takes to be an ally is attitude. You see that we've crossed out some of the attitudes that are not helpful in terms of being an ally. Because what we mean by attitude is an openness and a posture and a stance that it really is everyone's job to participate in creating a culture that's inclusive. And these are very common barriers to action. The attitude that it's not my business, the attitude that I might make things worse, concern that I'll be viewed as a troublemaker or too sensitive. If you have the attitude that you'll be intrusive or unwelcome, then it's very difficult to act. Lasheen, you've told me before that these kinds of concerns are what you can describe as imposter syndrome. You might feel, for example, on trans issues, if that's not how you identify, you logically might wonder, do I have a right to use my voice? And what if I get it wrong? Am I going to be overstepping?
See, my personal experience with allyship is that it's all right to admit to yourself that you don't have to be a part of the demographic that is going through the challenges to be a part of the solution. Georgine, I've found that a lot of people feel guilty about trying to be a champion of a cause that doesn't directly impact their race, their culture, or their gender, for example. But if you want to be a true ally, it's about using what makes you different as a way to influence others and perhaps your own demographic who don't understand the hardships that others face. Now, yes, it's a common fear, and so you might end up being a bystander. There is actually something called the bystander effect. This describes the phenomena that the more people there are to see something, the less likely they'll intervene. Why? I'm glad you asked. Observing people who witness an incident but do not intervene can cause someone to assume that the behavior is acceptable and they're the only one who is uncomfortable. Or, when many people observe a potentially harmful or unprofessional situation, individuals feel less personal responsibility to intervene. They may assume that, with so many people around, surely someone else will step in. And bystanders often wait in confusion to see if someone else will intervene. Now, this is a natural response, but it doesn't mean the impacted person doesn't need help.
So how can we act if we have awareness and the right attitude? Well, there are two types of actions a person can take: direct actions and indirect actions. We're going to start with direct actions first. Number one, you can speak up. You can speak up on behalf of yourself and how you feel uncomfortable with what you're seeing. And number two, you can show disapproval. You can do this even non-verbally quite effectively. For example, let's say Lasheen and I are in a meeting and our colleague says something offensive to Lasheen. It's not targeting me. In this situation, it would be more powerful for me to say, I don't feel very comfortable with what you just said to Lasheen, versus I don't think Lasheen appreciated what you just said. It's more powerful because I'm owning that I don't like how something went down. I'm not making assumptions about how Lasheen feels and trying to speak for him. What makes this a great approach is that I don't have to worry about whether I'm in the group or demographic that's the same one as Lasheen. I'm speaking up for myself, and I get to say on behalf of myself that I'm not comfortable. The same example works non-verbally. Sometimes it's not always possible to talk over somebody when something is happening. You can raise an eyebrow, you can give someone a look, you can move away from them, and you can shake your head. That can be more powerful, for example, in a virtual setting where it's impossible to sort of talk and sidebar with anybody.
Absolutely. Now, let's turn to something more subtle. Actions don't always have to equal a confrontation. Non-direct actions are what we call the 3 Ds: distract, delegate, delay. So let's take a look at these one at a time. Some ways, first is distract. I'm sorry, guys. Some ways you can employ distraction are asking the person engaging in the harassment or being aggressive for something so as to interrupt them, or to change the subject to something neutral. Telling the target that they have an urgent phone call or a meeting. Then once you're alone with the target, offer them support and admit that you just needed an excuse to get them out of the situation. Distracting allows you to diffuse a tough situation. It can also be a helpful way to gain more time to seek help from others. For example, if Georgine said something to someone else that has taken the temperature up to a bad place, I could say, Georgine, before we go in, can I sidebar with you? Now, this can be harder in a virtual context, as Georgine mentioned earlier, but it's still perfectly okay to say, can we put a pin in this topic and move on for now?
The second D in terms of indirect action is delegation. Delegation is about distributing responsibility. Instead of acting yourself in the moment, you can ask your colleague how they felt about the situation and ask them for help to intervene. You can get advice from someone you trust if you're not sure whether a behavior you witnessed is bad enough to report. You might want a second take or opinion on what happened. And then if you're pretty sure there was misconduct, you can, of course, reach out to your human resources colleagues. They're trained in this. And of course, if it's urgent and serious and physical, then you can always call security and dial 911. Delegation, at the end of the day, allows you to reach out for support. It calls on power and safety in numbers, so you're not an ally yourself. You're asking for help from someone with more authority or social pull. Remember the situation where Lasheen and I were in a meeting and someone said something inappropriate to him? I could offer to Lasheen to talk to that person and say to him, do you want me to talk to this guy about what he just said? Or alternatively, I could also reach out to HR. I think it'd be totally appropriate if we got their take on what happened.
Completely agreed there. And then the third D is delay. Asking the target if what happened just made them uncomfortable. Expressing concern. Going with the target to report something. Or offering to corroborate the target's version of events if you witnessed that incident. Now, delaying here means offering support to a target after the incident. It's a good tool for times when in-the-moment interventions are impractical or might do more harm than good. Some ways you can employ delaying are to say something like, Georgine, I'm a little worried about the way Bob assumed you wouldn't want the assignment because you were pregnant. Do you think I should talk to him? Would that be helpful?
This act of delayed allyship brings up an important point and question about allyship that some of you may have. When should you be an ally? Well, obviously, when something biased or discriminatory happens, when you're uncomfortable or when you see someone who's uncomfortable. But also, it's a little bit more subtle when something doesn't happen, but should happen to address bias or discrimination.
And the big question that a lot of you probably have is, when else can you be an ally? Guess what? All the time. Education and learning are lifelong processes. We're never done learning, guys. All day, every day.
Ultimately, as you can see from what we've discussed so far, allyship doesn't have to be only about grand gestures, big actions. Even little moments of support, empathy, and encouragement can really go a long way. These moments are especially important when the issues at play are not obviously egregious or illegal. It can just be chalked up to somebody or a group of people being insensitive. And we want to give you a couple examples from our own personal lives and professional experiences. And this is the part of our webinar today where we're going to share some of these personal anecdotes. I'll start by telling a story that I've shared with Lasheen before. He and I both used to work on Wall Street. And there was a period of time when the guys that I worked with, they were all guys, by the way, called me George and did a lot of things that I think they thought were pretty harmless, like push-up contests or going after work to drink pretty heavily. Sometimes I would get invited. I'd get invited to do the contest, invited to go out drinking, and I genuinely think that this was meant as a gesture of inclusion, and hence the nickname, right? I was being included as one of the guys. And I did try very hard to fit in. I tried to do those push-ups, even though I know I never win. I went out with the guys, even though I didn't necessarily always want to drink. I did it because I felt like I was going to miss out on group bonding or gossip or politics at work if I didn't go. This is not just me describing myself as a woman, but I think back and what if I had been in AA? What if I was a Muslim who couldn't drink? I think there wasn't a lot of thought given to different preferences or identities in that context. But I do remember, since we're talking about allyship, that a few of those individuals who worked with me, and some of them were guys, would check in to see if I really was feeling okay, let me know it was okay to skip out an event, didn't have to participate in the push-up contest. They probably didn't consider themselves allies when they did those things, but it did help. And I remember being feeling seen, and like I appreciated the recognition that I might feel differently, even though I was trying very hard to fit in. And lo and behold, those are still the people from that period of my life that I'm still friends with.
That's amazing that you were able to turn that around and have those examples of allyship, even in those uncomfortable situations in a time where Allyship was not really even a word, nothing that anybody was thinking about. And to your point, Georgine, I've also worked on Wall Street, and it's been a long time, but back then, anyway, I hope things changed. But back then, it was boys' clubs rules for sure. Now, because I grew up with just my mother and sisters, I never really saw the appeal of the boys' club. So when I got older, getting invites to the after hours bars or doing gross challenges to prove my manhood, like belches and stuff like that, those were things that I would decline like that. I was never going to do it. It just didn't seem fun to me. And the backlash of that is that I would get teased for not being a real man, or there would be those obvious implications that I was of an alternative sexual orientation. I think you guys know what I'm trying to say. So much so that when I declined the invitations, here's the crazy part. The guys would then turn around and invite a female coworker who's standing right next to me or whatever, and she would feel the need to gain acceptance from the boys' club so badly that they'd say yes, even if they didn't really want to go. It was almost as if they felt like they were able to take my empty slot. Since I didn't want to be one of the boys, she may have felt like she can step in and it'll help her with her career growth and her popularity in the office. So it kind of ties back to what you said, Georgine, about the days where you wouldn't want to do the push-ups or you wouldn't want to, go out drinking heavily, but you'd still suck it up and go anyway. That's what I felt these women were going through as well. And it's a give and take, right? In some ways, I feel good that I was able to say no and then give them that slot. But in a grander scheme of things, I feel bad that they felt the need to get accepted that much from the boys' club. So I really would hope that things on Wall Street have changed, but I wouldn't know because I'm never going back. In any event, we speak about ways that inclusivity, if done wrong, can be hurtful. And I wanted to share a story with you guys that I can now laugh at. I've shared this with Georgine a couple of times now. And it's equal parts cringy as it is funny, I guess, these days. But this is a story where, my old company that I was with for a long time, they thought they were doing the right thing, but it made me so uncomfortable. We started these family lunch Fridays, right? And every week they would order from a restaurant. They used to just do like soups and salads or pizza. And people started to complain. So they decided, hey, let's do like a specific culture every Friday, specific to the race of an employee, within the company. And there weren't many of us, there was not that much diversity. So we get to Lasheen Day, and being the only Black person in the office at the time, they decided to order 5 buckets of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now, I tried to think nothing of it. I tried to tell myself, everyone loves KFC. Don't overthink it. And then when the delivery guy buzzed our office, everyone put these huge smiles on their faces and looked directly at me. Instantly, annoyed me. But then the worst part, my boss pats me on my shoulder and says, I bet you can't wait for this. As if he's doing me some favor, or if he wants me to appreciate that he got me some fried chicken. And I couldn't, guys, I just could not give them the satisfaction of letting them see me eat the fried chicken. So I faked a doctor's appointment and I left. Now, here's the thing. Deep down, and I hate to admit it, but I have to be honest with everyone here. I wanted the chicken. It smelled so good. Our office was smelling like heaven right then and there. I was so like, oh my gosh. However, they made me feel so uncomfortable that this is extreme, but I guess I'm a little extreme. I decided to wait until lunch was over. I came back from my fake doctor's appointment. I think I really just went to H&M and did some shopping. And then I took a couple of pieces of leftover chicken from the break room when nobody was looking. And I was the fire safety director of the floor. So I had access to the freight elevator. So I took my little plate of chicken and I went to the freight elevator I turned the lights off and I ate by myself in the elevator because I was far too embarrassed and way too offended by their attempts at allyship.
Wow. Every time I hear that story, number one, I love fried chicken too, so I get a little hungry. But number two, it's it's such a great example of like this good intention instead of assumptions that nobody checked with you, right? Did you want that? They could have just asked you. If you felt like you're part of that decision, I think it would have made all the difference rather than it about the assumptions.
Completely right. That assumption was the worst part.
Right,
One took the time to ask if it was okay or if I even
right,
wanted it. And I think that's all it would have taken was someone in that room to even be an ally and speak on how it's uncomfortable for them to order fried chicken for the black guy. Like that would have been made a world of difference, and I would have found an ally within the company at that time.
right. So getting back to allyship, I think one thing that people can do is just interrupt instincts and see and think that someone may be uncomfortable with something. You know, I don't like golf. I don't like going to strip clubs. What if I had a disability or inability to play golf, or I had a physical issue? These were things that regularly happened around me and were like socially acceptable in the workplace. And I know things have changed now, but and they may be extreme examples in today's day and age, but I think little things still happen all the time. And all it takes in either those situations, the story, Lasheen, that you shared, is someone reaching out and saying, you know, it's okay not to go to one of these outings. Do you want to check that Lasheen actually wants KFC for lunch before just assuming? And you could say it to the organizer of an event. You can ask the person you think is uncomfortable whether they might want to do something different. You can suggest an alternative food or social gathering so that more people on the team can join. There's lots of ways to be an ally that don't necessarily involve confrontation if you're not somebody who wants to sort of be thought of as a troublemaker or insensitive. You can just suggest alternatives.
Absolutely agreed. So let's talk about some key takeaways, guys. When to be an ally. Again, when something happens that is biased or discriminatory. When something doesn't happen, to address bias or discrimination. And to me, the most important, all the time.
As a recap from earlier, how can you be an ally? First, it takes awareness. Be aware of how you feel, other people are feeling, the social dynamics, the temperature in the room. Have an attitude that you can be an ally. Don't assume that you can't, that it's going to be hard, that it's going to take a lot of education or grand gestures. Allyship can manifest itself in small moments and small interruptions. And that's the key, is really acting to check in on people, acting to suggest an alternative, acting to say that you feel uncomfortable.
Completely agree. So we would love to open the floor for any questions.